What happens when Hollywood's smoothest charmer gets cornered by a talk show host with a vendetta? George Clooney, the silver-haired icon with a grin that could disarm a nation, stepped onto Stephen's stage, expecting a friendly chat. Instead, he walked into a trap, one that would spark a clash so raw it would leave the audience gasping. The air crackled with tension before a single word was spoken, as Stephen, with his sharp eyes and sharper tongue, prepared to tear into George over a controversy that had simmered for years. This wasn't about a movie flop or a tabloid scandal. No, this was personal, rooted in a decades-old grudge that Stephen had nursed like a bitter wound. The stage was set for a showdown that would make headlines, and George, unaware of the storm brewing, was about to face a side of Stephen the world rarely saw. The feud traced back to the early 2000s, when George, at the height of his Ocean's 11 fame, had been a vocal advocate for better working conditions in Hollywood. He'd pushed for fair pay for crew members, shorter hours, and more respect for the unsung workers behind the scenes. Stephen, then a rising comedian on The Daily Show, had mocked George's activism in a biting segment, calling him a limousine liberal who pretended to care while sipping champagne with elites. The jab stung, not because it was clever, but because it twisted George's genuine efforts into something shallow. George never forgot it. He'd brushed it off publicly, but privately he saw Stephen as a smug opportunist who'd built a career on sneering at others. Now, years later, Stephen had invited George onto his late-night show, promising a fun, candid interview. George, wary but professional, agreed, thinking time had softened old wounds. He was wrong. As George settled into the guest chair, the audience's applause felt like a distant hum. Stephen leaned forward, his smile thin and predatory, like a cat toying with a mouse. "So, George," he began, his voice dripping with false warmth, "you've been saving the world one cause at a time, haven't you? Still playing the hero for the little guy?" The question landed like a slap, and the crowd's laughter was uneasy. George's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool, his eyes locked on Stephen. "I try to do what's right," he said evenly. "Not everyone gets it, but that's fine." Stephen smirked, sensing blood. "Oh, we get it. You're the guy with the perfect hair and the perfect morals, right? Never a misstep." The audience chuckled, but George's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You've got a lot to say about missteps, Stephen. Care to share some of yours?" The jab was subtle but sharp, and Stephen's face twitched. He wasn't used to guests pushing back, especially not A-listers like George. The crowd sensed the shift, their murmurs growing quieter. Stephen, eager to regain control, doubled down. "Come on, George, let's talk about that charity gala you hosted in Aero 8. Big promises, lots of cameras, but how much actually went to the crew you claim to love?" The accusation was a low blow, implying George had pocketed funds meant for workers. It was a lie, and Stephen knew it, but he'd done his homework, digging up just enough half-truths to make it sound plausible. George's eyes narrowed, his voice low and steady. "You're reaching, Stephen. You know those funds rebuilt homes for grip workers after the wildfires. Check the records." Stephen waved a hand, dismissing him. "Records, sure. Easy to spin a story when you've got a PR team bigger than most countries." George's patience snapped. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You want to talk spin? How about you, Stephen? Hiding behind jokes while you tear people down. You think that makes you clever?" The audience gasped, some clapping, others frozen. Stephen's smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. "Careful, George," he hissed. "This is my show." George didn't flinch. "Your show, your rules, but not your facts. You've been gunning for me since I started speaking up. Why? Because I actually stand for something?" The room felt smaller, the air thick with hostility. Stephen, red-faced, opened his mouth to retort, but George cut him off. You don't get to rewrite my life to fit your cheap shots. The crowd was on edge, sensing this was no scripted banter. Stephen, rattled but refusing to back down, leaned closer, his voice venomous. You think you're untouchable, Clooney? Big star, big causes, big ego. Maybe it's time someone called you out. George's laugh was sharp, almost cruel, and it echoed through the studio. Call me out? You're not calling out anything. You're just loud. The audience erupted, some cheering, others shouting. Stephen's face burned, his control slipping. He'd wanted to humiliate George, to paint him as a fraud, but George wasn't playing the victim. The argument was spiraling, and neither man was backing down. The producer in the booth signaled for a commercial break, but Stephen ignored it, too consumed by his need to win. George, sensing the chaos, stood up, his presence commanding. You want a fight, Stephen? You've got one, but I'm not here to play your game. The stage felt like a battlefield, the audience caught between shock and thrill. Stephen, desperate to regain the upper hand, slammed his desk. Sit down, George. We're not done. But George didn't move, his eyes burning with defiance. Oh, we're done, he said, his voice calm but lethal. Unless you've got something real to say. The challenge hung in the air, daring Stephen to escalate or fold. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move in a clash that was already legendary. George stood tall, his defiance like a wall Stephen couldn't breach. The audience, buzzing with nervous energy, hung on every word, their eyes darting, between the two men. Stephen's desk, usually a prop for his smug charm, now seemed like a flimsy shield. His plan to corner George had backfired, and the sting of it showed in his clenched fists. He wasn't used to losing control. Not here, not in his own domain. But George, with his steady gaze and unshakable calm, had turned the tables. The room pulsed with anticipation, every second stretching taut as the host scrambled to reclaim his stage. Stephen pushed back his chair, standing to match George's height, though he seemed smaller in the moment. His voice was sharp, cutting, through the crowd's murmurs. You think you can waltz in here, George, and lecture me? This is my house, and I say what's real. The audience gasped, some booing softly, sensing Stephen's desperation. George's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to unnerve Stephen further. Your house? George said, his tone low and deliberate. You're not running a show, Stephen. You're running a grudge, and it's getting old. The crowd roared, a mix of cheers and shocked laughter fueling George's fire. Stephen's eyes flashed with fury. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them, his face inches from George's. You're so full of it, he spat. Always the saint, always the savior. You think people buy this act? You're just a pretty face who got lucky. The insult was personal, meant to wound, but George didn't blink. He leaned in, his voice steady as steel. Lucky? I've worked for everything I've got. You, though? You've built a career on cheap shots and fake laughs. Who's the act here, Stephen? The audience erupted again, louder this time. Some clapping for George, others shouting at Stephen to back off. The host's face twisted, his composure crumbling. He'd wanted to expose George as a fraud, to drag up old rumors about his activism being a publicity stunt. But George wasn't playing defense. He was hitting back, hard, and Stephen wasn't prepared for it. You don't get to talk to me like that, Stephen snapped, his voice rising. I've been in this game longer than you think, and I know your type. All talk, no substance. George's laugh cut through the noise, sharp and unyielding. My type? You mean someone who actually shows up for what they believe in? You wouldn't know about that, would you? Too busy mocking people from your cozy desk. The crowd was electric now, feeding off the raw hostility. Stephen, sensing he was losing them, tried a different tack. Let's talk facts, George, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Your big Hollywood strikes, your speeches about saving the crew. Where were you when those same crews were laid off after your films wrapped? Schmoozing at some gala, probably. The accusation was another twist of the knife. But George was ready. I was there, he said, his voice rising for the first time. I was at the union meetings, fighting for those layoffs to be reversed. Where were you, Stephen? Making jokes about it on your little show while real people lost their jobs? The audience cheered, louder than before, and Stephen's face reddened. He hadn't expected George to know the details, to call his bluff so directly. The producer in the booth was frantic now, waving for a break, but Stephen pressed on, too deep in his own rage to stop. You're rewriting history, he hissed. You're no hero, Clooney. You're a guy who plays one on screen. George stepped closer, his presence towering despite their equal height. And you're a guy who plays smart on TV, he shot back. But you're not fooling anyone. Tonight. The crowd was on its feet now, some chanting George's name, others shouting at Stephen to sit down. Stephen, cornered, tried to pivot. This isn't about me, he said, his voice shaky but defiant. This is about you dodging the truth. You talk big, but when it comes to real change, you're nowhere. George's eyes burned with controlled fury. Dodging? I'm right here, Stephen, answering your garbage. You want truth? Try looking at yourself. You've spent years tearing down anyone who tries to do good, just to make yourself feel bigger. The words landed like a punch, and Stephen flinched, visibly rattled. The audience was a sea of noise, split between support for George and shock at Stephen's unraveling. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the weight of their words. Stephen, desperate to regain ground, pointed a finger at George. You're not walking away from this, he said, his voice trembling with anger. You think you can come here, throw your weight around and leave? Not happening. George didn't budge, his stance firm. I'm not leaving because of you, he said, his voice calm but cutting. I'm standing here because people deserve better than your lies. The crowd roared again, and Stephen's confidence cracked further. He'd pushed too far, and George was pushing back harder, turning the host's own stage into a battleground he couldn't control. As the noise swelled, George took a step back, not in retreat, but to let his words sink in. Stephen, breathing heavily, looked out at the audience, realizing he'd lost them. The producer signaled again, but Stephen's pride wouldn't let him stop. He opened his mouth, ready to fire another shot, but George raised a hand, silencing him without a word. The gesture was quiet, powerful, and it shifted the room's energy entirely. Stephen was exposed, and George was in command, ready to finish what Stephen had started. The studio pulsed with raw energy, the audience a roaring tide of cheers and gasps, their allegiance firmly with George. Stephen stood frozen, his finger still pointed, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. George's raised hand, calm yet commanding, had silenced him mid-rant, stripping away the host's usual swagger. The crowd's noise swelled, a chaotic mix of support for George and jeers at Stephen, who looked like a man drowning in his own mistake. He'd gambled on breaking, George on painting him as a hollow celebrity, but the plan had collapsed. George, unyielding, held the room in his grip, his presence a quiet storm that left Stephen scrambling. George lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving Stephen's. You done? He asked, his voice low but piercing, cutting through the crowd's din like a knife. The question wasn't just a challenge, it was a dare, a final chance for Stephen to back off or dig his grave deeper. Stephen's jaw clenched, his pride warring with the reality of his crumbling control. He stepped back toward his desk, trying to reclaim some authority, but his movements were stiff, unsteady. You don't get to run this, he snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. This is my stage, my rules. The audience booed, louder now, sensing his weakness. George's lips curled into a half-smile, not mocking, but confident. Your stage, maybe, he said, but you're losing your audience. The crowd erupted, their cheers for George drowning out Stephen's attempt to respond. He slammed, a hand on the desk, the sound sharp but futile. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "You're just a guy with a good suit and a better agent. You don't scare me, Clooney." The insult fell flat, the audience groaning at Stephen's weak jab. George didn't flinch, his calm a stark contrast to Stephen's unraveling. "Scare? You?" he said, stepping forward, his voice steady but laced with steel. "I'm not here to scare you, Stephen. I'm here to call you out for what you are. A bully who picks fights he can't win." The room exploded again. The crowd on, its feet, clapping and shouting George's name. Stephen's face burned, his eyes darting to the audience, then back to George. He'd never been this exposed, not in years of hosting, not in a career built on quick wit and sharp barbs. He tried to pivot, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Oh, please," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're acting like I'm the bad guy here. I'm just asking questions the public wants answered." George shook his head, his expression hard. "The public? You're not speaking for them. You're speaking for yourself, settling a score from years ago because you can't let it go." Stephen's eyes widened, caught off guard by George's mention of their old feud. The audience leaned in, sensing a deeper story, their murmurs growing quieter. Stephen tried to recover, leaning forward with a sneer. "You're bringing up ancient history? That's weak, even for you. I called you out back then because you deserved it, parading around like some savior while the rest of us actually worked." The lie was blatant and the crowd wasn't buying it, their boos growing louder. George's voice stayed calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "Worked? You mocked people fighting for a better industry while you sat behind a desk, cracking jokes. That's not work, Stephen. That's cowardice." The word landed like a thunderclap, and the audience gasped, then cheered, the sound overwhelming. Stephen's face twisted, his anger boiling over. He stepped closer, his voice a low hiss. "You don't get to call me that. You don't know what I've been through to get here." George didn't back down, his gaze unwavering. "I know enough," he said. "I know you've spent years tearing down anyone who threatens your ego. You picked this fight, Stephen, not me, and now you're losing it." The crowd roared again, their energy feeding George's resolve, while Stephen looked smaller, his confidence shattered. Desperate, Stephen tried one last jab, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you're untouchable because you're George Clooney? You're nothing without your fame." The attack was feeble, and George's laugh, sharp and genuine, cut through it like glass. "Fame?" he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. "I'd trade it all to keep doing what's right. Can you say the same? Or is this desk all you've got?" The audience was a tidal wave now, their cheers shaking the room, chanting George's name as Stephen stood speechless, his hands shaking at his sides. The producer in the booth was frantic, signaling for the cameras to cut, but the moment was too raw, too real to stop. George took a step back, not to retreat, but to let the crowd's reaction speak for him. Stephen, cornered, looked out at the sea of faces, realizing he'd lost more than the argument. His show, his reputation, his control, all were slipping away. George, still composed, gave him a final look, not of triumph, but of pity. "You wanted this fight," he said softly, his voice carrying over the noise. "Now live with it." The words hung heavy, a verdict Stephen couldn't escape, as the crowd's roar promised this moment would echo far beyond the studio. The crowd's roar was a living thing, a wave of sound that crashed over the studio, amplifying George's quiet victory. Stephen stood behind his desk, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge as if it could anchor him. George's final words, "You wanted this fight. Now live with it," hung in the air, a sentence Stephen couldn't dodge. The audience, still on its feet, chanted George's name, their voices a mix of awe and defiance, mirroring the man who'd turned their host's ambush into a rout. George, his expression calm but resolute, held Stephen's gaze, letting the moment burn. This wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning, and Stephen knew it. Stephen tried to salvage the wreckage, forcing a tight smile as he sat down, his movements jerky. "Well, folks," he said, his voice strained, "looks like we've got a lively one tonight." The crowd's response was a mix of boos and scattered laughs, but the energy was against him. He shuffled some papers, a weak attempt to look in control, and glanced at George, who hadn't moved. "So, George, ready to play nice now?" he asked, his tone brittle, a last-ditch effort to claw back some dignity. George's eyes narrowed, his voice steady and cold. "Play nice? I came here to talk, Stephen. You're the one who wanted a war." The audience erupted again, their cheers a wall of sound that drowned Stephen's weak chuckle. He leaned back, his face twitching with barely concealed rage. "You're good at this, I'll give you that," he said, his words clipped. "Always. The hero, right? Bet you love hearing them scream your name." The jab was desperate, a final swing from a man out of moves. George didn't bite. He stepped forward, his voice clear and deliberate. "I don't need their screams," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "I need people to know the truth. You tried to bury it, Stephen. You failed." The crowd's roar hit a new peak, some clapping, others shouting, their support a tide George rode effortlessly. Stephen's eyes darted to the producer, who was now standing, waving frantically to cut to commercial. But the moment was too big, too raw, to stop. George, sensing the end, turned to the audience, his presence filling the room. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice rising with purpose. "It's about the people I've fought for. Grips, electricians, the ones who make our work possible. They deserve better than being props in someone's cheap vendetta." The crowd cheered louder, some whistling, their energy a testament to George's authenticity. Stephen's face twisted, his attempt at a comeback stifled by the noise. "You're preaching now," he muttered, but no one cared. The audience was George's, and Stephen was a bystander in his own show. George turned back to Stephen, his voice dropping to a quiet, cutting edge. "You could have asked me about the work, the real work. Instead, you went for blood. That's on you." Stephen opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The crowd's chants grew louder, a rhythmic pulse of "Clooney! Clooney!" that shook the room. George didn't bask in it. He didn't need to. He'd come to clear his name, to expose Stephen's grudge for what it was. A petty personal attack disguised as journalism. And he'd done it, not with theatrics, but with truth, delivered with the precision of a man who'd faced worse and won. Stephen, defeated, slumped in his chair, his hands folded tightly. "We'll be right back," he said weakly, signaling for the break he'd ignored too long. The cameras cut, but the crowd didn't stop, their applause following George as he walked off the stage, his head high. Backstage crew members, grips, sound techs, the very people he'd fought for, nodded to him, their faces lit with respect. One older man, a lighting tech with weathered hands, clapped George on the shoulder. "You said what we've all wanted to," he whispered. George nodded, his smile genuine but tired. "Just doing what's right," he said, echoing his words from the stage. The studio was still buzzing as George left, the audience's energy spilling into the halls. Stephen, alone at his desk, stared at the floor, the weight of his misstep, crushing him. He'd wanted to tear George down, to make him squirm, but instead he'd given George a platform to shine. The story would spread, headlines, talk shows, word of mouth, and Stephen's reputation would take the hit. George, though, didn't linger on the victory. He'd come to set the record straight, to defend the people he'd promised to protect. As he stepped into the night, the city's hum around him, he felt no need to gloat. The truth had won, and that was enough. Back in the studio, the crowd's energy lingered, their voices still echoing as the crew prepared for the next segment. Stephen forced a smile for the cameras, but it was hollow, a mask for a man who'd lost more than an argument. George's laugh, sharp and defiant, would haunt him, a reminder that some fights aren't worth picking. For the audience, it was a moment they'd never forget, a clash where integrity triumphed over ego, where one man's stand turned a talk show into a battlefield, and one